Well, hello, dear friends everywhere. Hello, close personal friends around the globe, and those of you who are about to become new acquaintances, and those of you who have tuned in because you want to throw rocks or something at the screen while I'm on. You're all welcome to be here on Public Affairs, Public Access, here on the 14th of April in 2011, just a year away from whatever day it is. It's not exactly D-Day, it's not exactly M-Day, and it's not actually a day at all. It's kind of a way of looking at things. It's kind of a new universe coming into being for those of us who want to have a new one. I don't know why I had to bring that up right now, but it sort of just came to me. Tonight's show here on Public Affairs, Public Access, is hosted by yours truly, Paul Colby. A lot of you know that I'm sort of iconoclastic and freewheeling when I talk about public affairs, because you can't really pigeonhole me into any political constraining tight jacket, because my politics bleeds over into my metaphysics, and my metaphysics bleeds over into my office work. So I might say things that please you and things that offend you, but what I want to do tonight is to give you a really, really wide view of health. Health in America, health generally, whatever. You see, when I'm not on the guitar, behind the guitar, like I was on that exquisite introductory piece of music, I'm sometimes behind the podium, or sometimes behind the laptop, or sometimes behind on my email, rarely behind on my bills. I'm a man who wears many hats. And from that standpoint, in fact, I think I have a picture of some of the hats I've worn lately, and you know, just by way of illustration. By illustration and not by limitation. Anyway, I'm going to talk about public health, and I'm going to talk about personal health. And I'm going to put it in a context. You know, my staff worked real hard this week. They put together this briefing book for me, and it's not like the briefing books that a lot of world leaders use, because as you can see, there's nothing here that's classified. Everything I'm telling you, you can find it out for yourself, and at some points in this presentation, ladies and gentlemen, I'll even point you to the place on the internet or the place in the library, if you still remember what those are, that you can go find your own source material to read further, or to confirm or to deny things that I might be telling you here that could be true. Now, since we're talking about health, you know that there are a lot of books written these days where if some out of the mainstream idea is propounded, there's often a preface in a book about health saying, I, the author, don't take any responsibility for what you might do with this information, or how you might use this little wizard kind of product I created and I'm describing here. And I certainly don't guarantee that there will be any results, and you should always follow the advice of your doctor and whatever. You're not going to hear that from me, because what you're hearing about health tonight is one guy's learned observations covering a wide field of inquiries over a lot of years. So I'm going to just sort of be saying, here's a way to look at it. Here's a way some people do it. Here's the way some sea changes seem to be taking place in the public's view of health over a generation or over 100 years or whatever. And I'm going to say, if this is information you haven't heard, maybe it's something to think about, maybe you're entertained, maybe you're intrigued, and maybe you'll do something with the information. But I'm just here to broaden the perspective, or at least to give you my highly idiosyncratic perspective. And because that's true, I'm going to start a discussion about health with a discussion about national defense and foreign policy. Does that sound a little odd to you? Well, in case it does, let me just explain something as a general proposition. I think that in the current state of the world, the current state of this country, the current state of the planet and the population and the species and the other species that we bump around being our species, that it's time to think whether our defense budget is even healthy or not. It's supposed to be about defending these shores of ours and the things that are inside the shores. You know, I'm not just talking about the beach fronts. And, well, anyway, the defense budget is supposed to be about defending us. I want to take you back half a century ago, more or less, to what Dwight Eisenhower, who was, of course, a military man before he was president, said on his way out of the Oval Office. I think some of you know it very well. In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of, what do you call this word? Unwarranted. The acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. You know, the man couldn't have been more right. What we saw after the two world wars and the Korean War and heading into the 60s was the development of a permanent military infrastructure in the United States that had not previously existed. And as the military-industrial complex started doing jobs for the Fortune 500 companies primarily and through covert operations principally, it started to become a self-propelled juggernaut. It started to become a force all of its own, and it started to buy up everybody it needed so that it could keep expanding. The defense budget in those days was so small we wouldn't even believe it today. But think about what John Kennedy said right after Ike Eisenhower said what he said. He talked about a foreign policy that protects diversity. And that's not what we've done. We haven't walked our talk all of these years. What we've done is we have created a situation where by the present time, we spend half, perhaps a little less, perhaps a little more, of all the money that is spent on defense in the world. That means everybody else combined spends less than we do on defense. If that sounds like a big chunk, understand that we spend that, but we also sell armaments to the rest of the world. So that when we find ourselves in some military predicaments, we might be looking at our own weapon systems that got sold to somebody, that got stolen by somebody else, and that are now being used against us, with maybe 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 more stops in between. We have not been protecting the world in terms of diversity of ideas, in terms of democratic ideals, for a long time. You can point out maybe on 2 fingers, maybe 3 fingers of one hand, all of the cases where our military use of force is completely justified and completely accepted by a large percentage of the population now. Most of the use of force that we've done has been in secret, so that while the rest of the world knows it's been going on, we're talking about covert operations, some Americans don't. And so if you think back to what George Orwell talked about a long time ago, our enemies continue to change as our military machine maintains its stasis, and it has to create new enemies so that we can justify that it is still that big. For example, some of you will remember an article back in 1997 in the BBC News talking about the Taliban being in Texas, the Taliban being in Texas for talks about a gas pipeline. Our own distinguished Congressman Tom DeLay brought them to Sugar Land, you might remember. At that time, they weren't the enemy. They were somebody we were doing business with. Or maybe you want to go back a little further to 1983. You can look at the National Security Archive on the web and find the picture I'm referring to and a lot of documentation, but you probably have some memory of it because you've probably seen it. Donald Rumsfeld shaking hands with Saddam Hussein. And that was when Saddam Hussein wasn't the enemy. And why wasn't he the enemy? Because in the Iraq-Iran war, we wanted to make sure the right side won. And the right side wasn't Iran because they had caused us a lot of inconvenience. And so we wanted Saddam Hussein to win. But if you think about why Iran did what they did to us, you have to go back even further, back before Eisenhower gave his speech about the military-industrial complex, knowing what he did, because it was back in the day, in the 1950s, that the U.S. overthrew the government of Mossadegh in Iran and put the Shah in. A lot of people in Iran haven't forgotten that to this very day. The term blowback is what is usually applied to a discussion of American military power. The American military power that we're talking about includes probably 1,000 overseas bases. Nobody can really count them all. That's only appropriate if what you're trying to do is maintain an empire. Me, I'm one of the people, whether left or right, I bet there's a bunch of you, who never voted to have an empire. When you have an empire, what happens is people don't like you very much, especially when you occupy their countries when nothing is going on. The justification commonly given now for the millions and billions spent fighting terrorism, which incidentally had to be constructed as the new bogeyman after the Cold War was over, which has been a couple of decades now. The terrorism that we see today is not something that we actually are doing a very good job of defending against, because American military bases and American military spending have a great deal to do with why there is terror in the first place. Now, most of you probably know that, but I just wanted to set the context for the fact that we spend $700 billion, for the most part, on keeping the world in a mess. Imagine if we spent a tiny, 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 tiny fraction of that amount on a Department of Peace and actually talked to all of the people who don't like us and actually made some change from what's been going on forever, well, not forever, for half of this century anyway, of about 16% of the people in the world consuming 80% of its natural resources and leaving lots of people without jobs. And that includes now Americans without jobs, because corporations following the model of the military-industrial complex have become bigger and bigger, bought more and more politicians, and now they've not bothered to even worry about whether Americans get jobs for good PR. They just send them overseas if it's cheaper. So I'm going to be telling you that in health, you have a new version of the corporatocracy, you know that word, corporatocracy. A new version in which other people have followed the model, other institutions, excuse me, have followed the model of the military-industrial complex and become very, 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 very wealthy and very, very, very politically connected. So, if we look at the American system of health, which American propaganda likes to say is the best system in the world, you'll see that it basically has at the top, say, a priesthood, call that the American Medical Association, and then you have a couple of giant players right now, which would be the pharmaceutical companies and the health insurance companies. They are largely determining what our current public health system is about. And because that is true, ladies and gentlemen, we don't really have the best medical care in the world. And with a couple of years of debate on a health care bill, I'm sure you've heard most of the essential arguments about all of that many times, but do recall that all of the other industrialized nations provide some kind of universal health care coverage. Remember also that according to the World Health Organization, the United States is not number 1, the best, but number 37. So, for example, if you were in Italy, San Marino, Singapore, Monaco, Norway, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, the UK, Cyprus, Germany, Finland, or a lot of other countries, you could say, we have a medical care system that's better than the richest nation on the earth that, by the way, spends $700 billion on military expenditures. And remember also that we can't, with a straight face, say that ours is the best health care system in the world, when one of the most disturbing facts is that health care system itself is actually the 3rd leading cause of death. That's right behind heart disease and cancer, because you have, for example, way over 10,000 deaths a year due to unnecessary surgery. You have about 7,000 deaths in hospitals due to medical errors in hospitals. You have about 20,000, no, that's wrong, about 80,000, excuse me, due to infections in hospitals, and way over 100,000 every year in terms of negative effects of drugs that are being prescribed. So for all those reasons, you could say that even though we have some of the most sophisticated equipment, we have some of the best technology out there, and we do very well with dealing with medical traumas like car wrecks, horrible things like that. We don't do very well with things that can be prevented and things that should be addressed with lots less money being involved. That's because we have a system that is based on profit. It is not a system that is necessarily based on health. Because it's so expensive, ladies and gentlemen, quite a few individuals have taken things in their own hands over the last generation or two and started looking back at things that existed before or things that have existed for thousands of years in other cultures, like the things that existed until recently in the United States that are now considered unconventional or alternative, but once were part of the mainstream. Now, let's talk for a minute about the AMA, that priesthood at the top. The AMA, as you probably know, was not always a big, giant player, and it wasn't always the dominant force saying what is appropriate in medicine. But George H. Simmons, back in the turn of the century era, turned that small organization into a pretty big tiger. One of the things that the AMA did in those early days was to create a sort of stamp of approval. You can read extensively about the history of the AMA, but what I'm going to focus on here is the fact that the education committees originally established by the AMA had an effect on what happened in conventional medical schools, and generally eased out homeopathic treatments and other existing mainstream at the time remedies in favor of the AMA's new version of what was appropriate. At a point later on, Mr. Simmons got himself kicked out of the AMA because of some problems with his propaganda department, which is what it was called, and various scandals. And the operation then kind of drifted to the PR guy, who was a Dr. Fishbein, who never really was a practicing medical doctor, but was real good at PR. And what he did on a pretty inflated basis was to start attacking almost everything the AMA didn't like as medical quackery. That included things like osteopathy and homeopathy, which are hardly all that radical, as some of you who practice them know now. But over time, the emphasis of American medical care went to what we see today. It's a completely different approach. It's based on sort of treating symptoms, not curing something, but making symptoms be quiet. And one of the main things that's been used is drugs. And we, generally speaking, have not conquered a lot of the diseases that are problems for Americans today. In fact, we just keep treating them and treating them and treating them. Now, there is a report, the Report 12 of the Council on Scientific Affairs of the American Medical Association, that is a fairly recent vintage, that's a pretty extensive comparison of all of the things in medicine that are not AMA mainstream, that I highly recommend to you, primarily because it is a measured piece that covers different points of focus, and it talks about the value of other systems and the differences between the approach that is being taken by these other approaches and the way the AMA likes things to be treated. For example, most of the alternative procedures speak of the importance of spiritual values to health. They talk about the integration of individuals into the stream of life. They talk about use of whole unsynthesized substances, for example, when you're talking herbal medicine. They maintain the injunction of doing no harm, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's a nice piece that you might want to read, and it shows the differences. But I want to tell you why the differences exist in large measure. That's because of two principal players and the body that regulates things for them, the FDA, which interacts both with the big pharmaceuticals and the health care provider industry. So if you think about it, the FDA is supposed to be a watchdog that makes sure that everything is being done correctly in terms of what kind of testing is done for drugs and what kind of efficacy they show and so forth. Now, remember that medical schools are largely the property or the precinct of large pharmaceutical companies that finance drug research and that also contribute to a lot of the conventional medical schools. That's how they got their strong point of influence. And it is fair to say that armies of sales representatives for pharmaceutical industries have for a long time descended on doctors' offices selling them drugs that they can use to treat things that patients come to complain about. The FDA, in this context, has done a good job for the pharmaceutical industry by, in recent years, prohibiting consumer lawsuits for some faulty pharmaceuticals which the FDA has given its approval for. Under the guise of tort reform around 2002, the Bush administration essentially relieved the FDA of product liability in many of these areas. And you probably remember at the time that there were scientists in the FDA, as opposed to officers of the FDA, who appealed to the president-elect, Barack Obama, because of pressures from management that they were experiencing to manipulate data in terms of the review of medical practices and medical drugs. They characterized the FDA system as corrupted and distorted by the current FDA managers. Whose side were they on? Well, basically, Big Pharma's side. Pharmaceutical industry comes into being a long time ago when the Rockefeller family funded a lot of university and medical schools. In about 1939, the Rockefeller Foundation also formed a drug alliance with the German firm IG Farben. That industry, of course, the pharmaceutical industry, has grown to probably $500 billion ballpark in today's world, but it started from those early fundings by the foundation. Now, one of the things that all that money the pharmaceuticals have been able to put into the political system has guaranteed via the FDA is faster drug approvals. And we saw that in the early 2000s, and we saw it again in about the mid-2000s, 2006, that they were speeding up approval processes so that they could get more drugs to market. And there's been more developments of recent vintage since the era of using generic drugs has converted the market into two principal players, the big pharmaceuticals and the little pharmaceuticals. You see, a lot of generic drugs have had patents coming to expire, not generic drugs, but labeled drugs. And since they are coming to expire, that means that the little pharmaceuticals, not the 5 or 6 majors, should be able to jump into a vacuum and produce generic drugs that no longer are patented and, make some of the money. Well, it's not working that way because in 2010, the FDA removed 500 generic drugs from the market. Impact, meaning those people, the little pharmaceuticals, can't afford to do the testing that is necessary to get the drugs back into their status of being marketable, but big pharmaceuticals can. And instead, they'll sell the branded versions because, they cost more. The other party that makes a great deal of money in the current healthcare system is the insurance companies that manage health care. That profit level is estimated in recent years to be about $12 billion, and that at the same time that several million Americans have lost coverage as those profits keep rising. The main thing to remember about the health insurance companies today and also the pharmaceuticals is that their support of political parties, which gives them their tremendous influence, has been distributed roughly equally between Democrats and Republicans. It used to go primarily to the Republican Party. Now it has gone in considerable measure to both parties on an equal basis. For example, last cycle around, other than John McCain, who is at the top, Max Baucus, the Democrat, was the largest receiver of campaign contributions from these guys, and he was also the guy in charge of Obama's health care bill, what eventually got its way through Congress that was called reform. So, the reform, I would like to point out, didn't have very much to do with health care. It had only to do with the delivery system, and it left in place the power of the pharmaceutical companies and the power of the health insurance providers, both of whom are in the medical services area to make money, not to guarantee public health. About that, I shall say more later. But here's your point to consider. What do the powers that be, here the FDA operating along with the AMA, do with things that are not part of the mainstream? Historically, they've tried to make sure that they can't make it into the mainstream. And I would point out just a few examples of things that have happened in the past and that happen up to this very day. Some of you may remember stories about William Reich, who was one of the wildest thinkers of his day, but also in a very good way. He, in areas of psychoanalysis and in various other associations with folks like Freud, with whom he worked, and Einstein, with whom he met sometimes, this man did a bunch of thinking and a bunch of writing and was pretty well respected up until the time when he started working with his patients' sexual problems by being a little bit unofficial with office routine, actually touching them and things like that, and then going so far as to develop a device that was called the orgone generator. He was hounded by the FDA and the AMA for a long time, and some of you know that he died a horrible death after being out of favor for a long time. But what is interesting to know in this long perspective of history is that some of the things that he was studying a long time ago and some of the things that he said worked have in recent years, especially since the 1960s, because a lot of his papers were sealed for a long time, have been independently confirmed by distinguished universities. In the same sense, and by distinguished universities, I mean, for example, the University of Marburg and the University of Vienna. William Reich, of course, is still an influence for a lot of people in areas of psychoanalysis, and still a pioneer in some respects, but not nearly the pioneer that Royal Rife was, who also had all sorts of problems with the government. Royal Rife invented the first microscope that enabled a human, being him, to actually see a living virus. And Royal Rife is the inventor of many things before he invented what is commonly now called the Rife machine, which is something that can do a job on viruses. The main thing that you want to remember when you think about Royal Rife is that technology of the sort he developed is still being used today and is still being studied today, and it would have the advantage in things like cancer of providing a treatment that costs well under the hundreds of thousands of dollars that traditionally go with a long-term commitment of Western medicine to deal with cancer. In some cases, when you're spending over $10,000 a month on cancer treatments, it doesn't take very long for the dollars to add up. But imagine that there is a device, a machine, and a nutritional product or what have you that can actually do the job for way, way less. What do you think is going to happen? Well, it's pretty predictable in an area where so much money is to be made. A guy who won 14 major awards in his lifetime, and a guy who looked for answers beyond the rigid, structured thinking of the day, and a guy who was probably 2 generations ahead of his peers in the 30s, gets hounded. And let's go back to the AMA, where I started this discussion about the fundamental players right now. What Dr. Fleischbein tried to do when Royal Rife was being so well received by most of the community was to try to buy him out. That was a technique that was often used. If you could buy somebody out, then you could protect the big profit structure. But in Royal Rife's case, he couldn't be bought out. Later on, Royal Rife's equipment was mysteriously destroyed, not all of it, but a lot of it, and he was hounded to the point where he eventually didn't carry through, frankly, and that's in spite of the fact that he was endorsed by some of the leading scientists of his day. He had a mortal oscillatory rate instrument called the MOR that probably could deal with every virus that we know today. There's a set of companion products that were invented by Hulda Clark called the zappers. And Hulda Clark's zapper devices actually operated by killing parasites. Now, why is killing parasites important? Well, because it's estimated that approximately 90% of people in North America and the U.S. at some point in their life, and often for large parts of their life, have parasites. They don't necessarily know it, but parasites can eventually lead to all sorts of complications, and they can be cured in the view of some, in particular in Hulda Clark's view. You may know her book, The Cure for All Diseases. They can be killed by using a zapper. I have a few zappers. I find them fascinating, very, very useful for health. But the zapper, of course, since it's a very quick way to get healthy, and since it, in the minds of some, treats so many different things, it's threatening to a profit center where tons of money can be made putting people in hospitals and giving people prescription drugs and what have you. So it's, needless to say, predictable that somebody with a device like the zapper, which I bought, somebody like that, Hulda Clark, would be also hounded, and in fact she was. And in fact there are cases where when the FDA feels like it wants to make a stir again, they go after people. There's a famous case of recent vintage that involves Jim Folson, who sold a similar device to the one that were made, because what you should understand is that there are many variations now of using electrical potentials to deal with things like parasites and to deal with things like viruses. And in the minds of some, as I say, they work real well, so well that they're kind of like a health tonic. They keep you healthy before any of that stuff gets to be a problem. But there are prosecutions, and it's not just things like that. I'm giving you examples of things that are outside of mainstream technology and that also have the promise of taking care of all sorts of problems. This is not limited just to people who invent things like this. It is also invented to people, it is also applicable to people like Michael Moore, whose movie Sicko challenged America's healthcare system. And in a recent show with Amy Goodman, a whistleblower who worked inside the health insurance industry, famously talked about discussions in which the insurance companies got together and over a conference table said that if they couldn't stop it, they were going to push Michael off a cliff. Amy Goodman, in talking to this whistleblower, asked if he thought they were serious, and he said, well, I didn't think so at the time, but now I'm not so sure. You see, Michael Moore's Sicko was important enough to make some people think that socialized medicine might not be a bad idea, however called, socialized medicine or whatever you want to call it. And so they had to snuff that out. I mean, this continues to this very day. Earlier in April, the legislature in North Carolina was working on a bill that would criminalize homeopaths, naturopaths, midwives, herbalists, and anyone else practicing non-conventional medicine. There is a gigantic industry that makes a lot of money that is supposed to be keeping people healthy. It is making a lot of money. And so, you know, anytime you watch TV at night, the main thing you're going to see is ads for pharmaceutical products. And you probably think, well, okay, that's just the way it is now. That's the world we live in, and it's probably like that everywhere. Well, no, it's not like that everywhere. It's like that in the United States and New Zealand. That's where you see pharmaceutical ads. Before the push to have pharmaceutical advertising on TV, it was a sleeper of an industry, but drug ad spending, and then corresponding profits have jumped by 330% in 10 years, largely as a result of advertising pharmaceutical products on TV. And you know, the thing about it is that there are so many opportunities for pharmaceuticals to make money, pharmaceutical industries, to make money with Americans who buy drugs and are used to them because, I mean, these days kids grow up seeing a medicine cabinet. Most kids, until they see there's an alternative, don't realize that food can have something to do with health and that herbs can have something to do with health and that exercise is important and that you don't need a pill for everything. Well, I'm going to tell you, here's an ad that I would propose. I thought about it. I just got frustrated. You know, I got so I used to get bothered by life's frustrations, but not anymore. My answer is damn it all. But before you go to another slide, damn it all. That'd be my product, wouldn't it? But you don't have to use damn it all, because you have drug companies literally, and this is the headlining that you will see. If you can find plenty of these articles. I just found an archived article here about the drug companies with the headline, "Drug Companies Inventing Diseases to Boost Their Profits." Literally, inventing diseases to boost their profits. I mean, if you watch TV at night, you can't let an hour go by without hearing that there's something for if you ate too much, or if you pee too much, or if you worry too much, or if you think too much, or if you snore too much. So that's what it comes down to. And all of these drugs that they want people to take, even if we assumed for a moment that they dealt with the necessary problem and they actually fixed a symptom, which I'm telling you right now is not the way to go about looking for health, you would have to be wondering to yourself when you listen. I mean, listen for an hour, run them all together, and tell me what you're talking about when you hear a product that is supposed to be fixing something. You might hear about serious allergic reactions, swelling of the face, lip, tongues, throat. You might be talking about dizziness, or fainting, or aggression, or hair loss, frequent urination, blurred vision, severe skin reactions, itching, loss of appetite, difficulty breathing, thoughts of suicide, constipation, dry mouth, loss of muscle control, hallucinations, disturbing dreams, gas with oily discharge, compulsive behaviors, drowsiness, lack of concentration, fatigue, personality changes, restlessness, sleeplessness, constipation, bone loss, serious cardiovascular events, chest pain, headache, bloating, nausea, severe infections, excessive bleeding, slower, difficult speech, leg cramps, excessive sweating, flu-like symptoms, etc., 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 etc. I mean, are we talking here about the disease, or are we talking about the cure? I'm telling you, those things don't work. And you know, and honestly, it's bad news even having to hear them. So I don't want to be upsetting you. The number one thing to say about all of this is, one, if you have been given a pharmaceutical drug and it's doing its job, then of course the way I look at it is, if it's working, then you don't need to fix it. And generally speaking, there can be cases where there's going to be a pharmaceutical drug that does line up well with the human that it's taking it. The problem with Americans, more than anybody else, but Americans, is that most Americans are already taking something. And that means something as simple as something for their heartburn or for their headaches or whatever, and then they're taking something else, and then they're taking something else. And that means that everything is going to have side effects that are based on the other things that you're taking, all right? So to the extent that you keep stacking one on top of the other, you're going to overdo it. And so before I leave this subject and go on to one other aspect of what our fundamental issue is, maybe I can lighten it up with a discussion about, say, some products we could invent, all right? So like we could invent, here's a drug that I think has great potential. You know what I'm saying? Let them see it there. Well, I think you can see it already. Botoxic. That's what it is. It's for whatever ails you, but at a price, okay? I could put this out tomorrow, and you know, every time you do that, you have to talk about the possible symptoms, and I'm sure you're always hearing about the symptoms I've just read to you. You know, while you watch a football game or Star Trek or CNN or something, you probably heard half of these things I mentioned. But if we're going to have drug side effects, I just have to think we could be more creative with the side effects. So for my new product here, Botoxic, I want to tell you that Botoxic is not for everyone. So please be sure that your doctor knows which drugs you take when you attend rock concerts. Persons with a history of skinny dipping and men who are pregnant should not take Botoxic. Do not operate spacecraft until you know how Botoxic affects you. Rare but mysterious side effects have been reported, including the growth of small tentacles and feelings of instability unsupported by actual evidence. Now tell me that sounds nothing like the so-called real ones that you're already hearing on TV. Well, before finishing, let's just say that we have covered some of the territory now. You have a giant industry that makes money attending to people's healthcare needs, real or imagined, okay, real or imagined, and policed by the FDA and the AMA at the top, doing the bidding of those who give the most to the medical schools and conventional medicine, and the politicians who are in debt to big campaign contributors. Okay, so that's largely the playing field. And when I say that, obviously, I'm not saying all doctors are evil, all corporations are evil, all decisions by the FDA are wrong, all attempts to regulate non-conventional treatment are wrong. I'm not saying that. I'm saying look at how the situation is stacked against you actually making sense of your health care options. I want to mention just in passing before I shift this over to a discussion of what things could be like and already are like for many people by mentioning the environment. Because when we think of environment, we are usually saying, I'm talking about environmental issues, and when we talk about health, we're saying, I'm talking about health issues. But except for the people who believe all of the studies financed by Exxon, either openly, indirectly, or secretly, that say there's no such thing as global warming, we know that there are consequences of the things going on in the environment. We know that there are fish that show up on our plates with lots of toxins. We know that there are food products that have all sorts of problems inherent in them because of the way they're grown. And we know that the people who want to make genetically modified versions of things can do so and not say they're genetically modified, even though some people, thankfully these days, can say that their product isn't genetically modified. But understand that in the large context, your environment is also part of your health. So whenever we talk about things like greater environmental controls and people who are corporate leaders or who are politicians talking for corporate leaders say, oh, this is talking about taxation and this is a burden on corporations, seem to be forgetting that we live on this one earth and that if we screw it up, we can't just go rent a new one. This is the one. So there are some things that are more important than profits. I think Gaia is going to do fine no matter what we do, all right, in terms of messing Gaia up. But think about us. We're the ones who already have the toxins in our air and our water and often in our food. So just remember that when you think about the background. But enough of this bad news. Enough of this bad news. I got a medicine cabinet that's not based on all of this. I'm not saying that's what you should do, but I'm saying that's what I do. See, like all of my, well, actually, to be perfectly honest, this has got as many marinades as it does herbs and spices, but I want to make the point here that in the world of flora out there, in the world of plants and animals, but mostly plants and mostly herbs, you have all sorts of natural alternatives. Now, I know you're not all vegetarians, and you can find useful things in food no matter what you eat, but my point here is primarily about herbs, things that you can even grow yourself. And have you noticed that over the years, as healthcare becomes more expensive and stuff like that, that more and more people take gardening and making their own food into their hands because they're starting to get the connection and they're acting on it. So if you don't know about all the things like basil can do, namely preventing cell damage, or ginger can do, treating nausea, or fenugreek can do, treating menstrual cramps, or parsley can do to provide you antioxidants, turmeric to pretty much gut cancer cells overnight, particular kinds of gullet cancer cells. There is plenty of information on the internet talking about herbal medicine, which is having a rebirth right now. And my thinking is, why would somebody not try something natural first before opting for a pharmaceutical that they saw advertised on TV? Even things like depression, where we are told constantly that it's a result of a chemical imbalance in the brain. That's not even true, folks. In 1983, the National Institute of Mental Health said that there was no evidence that there is anything wrong in the serotogenetic system of depressed patients. And so, you know, if some of the depressed patients ate better and looked at some of these herbal therapies, they might be able to do without these prescription drugs that are the normal method of treatment. I have to have a very quick aside to mention that since everybody is thinking these days about radiation and heightened levels of radiation that are elsewhere on the planet but that are starting to show up here, that it's again in the world of fruits and vegetables primarily that you're going to find some instant relief, because you're not going to go to the doctor necessarily and say, I've got radiation problems. But you can already start looking at things that are useful. Brown rice, seaweed, kelp, miso, pumpkin, spirulina, bee pollen, wheatgrass, rosemary, blue-green algae, beets, garlic, ginger. All of those things have something to do to be ameliorative with respect to problems of radiation. So, a vast alternative to all of the drugged versions of what we do and the surgeries that we do and some of the treatments we do after cancer, some of that could be taken care of with better nutrition and even with things that are totally free, like yoga, qigong, things that are ancient, thousands of years old, that people have been doing for thousands of years because they work. If you were doing yoga for a long time, you probably wouldn't have some of these horrible diabolical things happen to you later on in life. So eat good, and do something that is meditative and that connects your mind and body and especially quiets the mind. Okay, a lot of people, you're already doing that. Good for you. I want to point you in the direction of quantum physics, because while some people know quantum physics and spirituality have to do with where we're starting to see the potential for medicine, we're not really there yet. But in every culture, every medical tradition before ours, as Nobel laureate Albert Szent-Györgyi said long ago, all of those traditions, healing was accomplished by moving energy. I want to point to you some reference materials where you can do more work. One of those would be the work of James Oshman. He wrote a book on energy medicine, The Scientific Basis. I told you before about things like electricity having an effect on the body. He covers tons and tons of treatments over various years that were unconventional and provides various hypotheses for why they work. Another book that you probably want to check out is Bruce Lipton's book on the biology of belief. This book, The Biology of Belief, and I think we might have a slide for that, but it's an easy word to remember. There you go. This book takes apart completely the notion that genes control biology. actually they don't control biology. They don't control, the DNA is controlled by signals from outside the cells, including energetic messages from our positive and or negative thoughts. Another one you want to look at, Amit Goswami's book, The Physicist's Guide to Health and Healing, that turns the Cartesian model on its head and suggests all sorts of ways in which the unconscious, the irrational, or you can say it better, the unrational part of us, the divine works through us metaphorically to heal diseases, and can do so even when modern science says it can't be healed. But especially, he goes to the level of discussing not just the connection between mind and body, or mind and medicine, but spirit and medicine. And that's in the realm of miracles. So, if I had another hour, there's a lot more I'd like to say about health care reform and about options. I'll leave you with the thought that Norman Cousins, in his book on anatomy of an illness, talked about, and he was talking about his own condition when diagnosed with a terrible, terrible fatal disease. He checked himself into a hotel. He had a nurse read funny jokes and watched the Marx Brothers for a long time and miraculously recovered. Now, we can't reform a system overnight, and we didn't get any health care reform the last time through Congress because what we got was a health care delivery system reform, and nothing that enables me to go to my government and say, I'd like to take the yoga class, and it's my taxes, I paid for it, rather than support a giant national defense establishment. I want my national health care. It can be an American model, it can be based on things from all over the earth, but it can be a system that is about taking care of people and not just healing them instead of keeping them on a treadmill for years of paying money for things, but instead something that's about wellness. Wellness. That's where a whole lot of the world is heading right now. I'd like you to be well, all you friends out there. And now I'd like to go back to one of my alter egos for some closing music. It's always nice to hear me sing as I'm off duty. Bye.
Although a war in Indochina and a president or three have all slipped into the shadows, I'm still in love with me. And though my crises of identity and purpose linger on, I'm touched by my convictions, and I'm not the only one. And it goes on and on. What's gone is gone. It's a good life and a hard life. It goes on and on. Sing la chanson. It's a mistress and a midwife. It's a long way to the future, and you'll never get there in your new car. You'll never get there in your new car. You'll never get there in your new car.